up. We've only done this twice before on a storytelling stage, and Jenny was involved both times, so she's a little bit of the mastermind behind this. But we actually have a couple who is going to come up and tell a story together. That's why we got the 2 mics. They've told stories up in Sioux City separately, but now we're going to bring them up together. So we have Branden Bullington. He is an Air Force veteran who now works by day as a traveling nurse recruiter and by night as super dad. You can totally tell who wrote the bios. Jenny Bullington is an author, world traveler, and advocate against domestic violence. She serves on the board of directors for a nonprofit called Survivors Rising. Together, the Bullingtons are redeeming their lives through one adventure at a time while raising their 5 children. Let's welcome Branden and Jenny Bullington.
I was finally sitting across the table from her. The lights were dim in the restaurant, traditional Asian music serenading us. The candles flickered on the table, lighting up her smile. I was completely smitten, my nervously excited heart racing. I wasn't looking to get any that night. I was just hoping she'd like me the way that I did her. In the short amount of time I knew her, I already felt more love than I had ever felt before in my life.
Here was this handsome man with whom I'd spent so much time getting to know over the phone, text, and messaging. I knew him inside and out before I even had met him in person. I even made him take a personality test just to be sure I'd like him. I knew he was the one I was looking for all my life. He was just like me, and his story was eerily similar to my own.
You could say we're a bit of an online dating success story.
We ate rice with chopsticks and laughed until it hurt, and then laughed some more. I watched him sigh his contentment as he gazed at me with his bright blue eyes, my own heart feeling the same. It had been so long since either of us had been truly happy.
When I graduated from high school, I went straight into the Air Force. I was thrilled for the adventure, for what life was going to have in store for me. I'd been stationed in South Dakota where I took part in some ranch rodeos. Then I was stationed in Alaska where my life took a turn for the worse.
I'd always been ambitious. Nothing could hold me back. I went to college at Iowa State at only 17 years old, full of fervor for the Lord. I was an easy target for those who preyed on the young, naive zealot.
I hadn't been in Alaska long when I got involved with a small storefront church that liked to evangelize young believers on the military base. It had 8 members and only 1 single woman.
I got involved with a church organization that actively sought out college students on campus.
I wanted to be a good person. I wanted to make a difference in the lives of others. After all, that's what I did the best since I was young. Making others happy. Soon I heard how the church leaders had been praying for someone young and passionate to come and help them. Then I showed up. God called you to be a pastor, they'd tell me. We always needed someone like you. Hearing them say this was like having the stadium from those ranch rodeos chant my name, Branden, Branden. How could I say no? I thought maybe this was why I ended up in Alaska. They were especially happy with me when the collection plate was full.
I dove into student ministry, preparing to be a missionary to Kazakhstan during summer break. I wanted to fit in, to be a leader, to do good for the world. Then the church group started focusing on Christian marriage, at least their version of that. You weren't supposed to date. You were only supposed to court with the intention of marriage. And you had to be a part of these relationship classes. Control was masked as devout piety. But I wanted to please the Lord and please these people who began to take these positions of power over me. They had convinced me over time that they were so spiritually enlightened that they could help me decipher God's will for me. Surely if they said, "This is how God wants me to live," they must be right.
I began to regard the pastors and elders as men who spoke the very words of God. I believed them. I trusted them. I loved them. My dad wasn't around much when I was growing up, and now that I had father figures who showered me with attention, stationed so far from home, the church people were all I had. So when they urged me to become a pastor, I did. 2 years later, they shocked me with their next command. They wanted me to get married to the person of their choosing. This church only had 8 members with only one single woman. The ministers looked around and said, "Yep, she's the one God picked for you." I knew that they were wrong, but no one ever went against their wishes.
Soon I met someone through the church, and 2 weeks later, I was engaged. My entire family was against it from the beginning. I was only 18. That should have told me something. So should have the time I watched my then-fiancé spin into a rage and throw canned food at the wall of his apartment, making holes, which he later covered up with a picture of Jesus. But I wanted to please my church leaders. I was afraid of what they would think of my faith if I backed out.
When I met the woman I was supposed to marry, I told her that we should just be friends. I hardly knew her. I wasn't attracted to her. We had nothing in common. And I got this bad feeling about her that I couldn't shake. I knew she wasn't who she pretended to be. After we'd met, she went to the church leaders and told on me. The pastor and his wife told me that they knew God's will better than I could at 23 years old, and I had better beg for this woman's forgiveness. A couple weeks later, I made one of the biggest mistakes of my life. Surrounded by the 6 other church members, I married a stranger. The whole day I felt sick to my stomach. I wasn't allowed to tell my family anything until 2 days before the wedding. I'd been warned that the devil may use that to break us up.
I ended up going through with the marriage, convinced that this was a test of my faithfulness and obedience to the Lord. The abuse began on my honeymoon. The fits of rage I'd only seen taken out on other objects, like his car door or the walls of his apartment, were now taken out on me. I had a sickening feeling that maybe my family hadn't been right after all. And I couldn't get out now, because the church also taught divorce was a sin, a sign of not praying or trying hard enough. It didn't take long for the abuse to escalate, fueled by his then-hidden addiction to alcohol. I quickly became convinced I was not going to live to be an old woman.
The verbal abuse began just days into the marriage. Simple things like going to the grocery store to get something for her turned into a full evening of her screaming, "That's the wrong loaf of bread. Why can't you do anything right?" Everything that went wrong in her life, she blamed on me. I watched her throw temper tantrums like she had been a child. I had entered her constant storm of emotional chaos with no way out. If quoting the Bible verse didn't get her way, she'd lean on her other standby and say, "If you really loved God and loved me, you'd actually do things right." Or she'd cry at the drop of a hat. She played the victim role to perfection, stirring up a pot of guilt and sympathy and serving it to me in heaping ladlefuls.
Using religion to control me, I was soon cut off from my family because they weren't the right kind of Christian. My abuser didn't like them speaking against his authority over me. I felt as though there was no way out, especially after I had children. I was cut off from anyone outside of the church, where it was so easy to hide the abuse. It was the type of church that was big on subservient women. I had to beg for money for groceries, while I watched the man that I married come home with alcohol for himself. I was living in constant pain, both physically from the injuries he'd inflict and in my shattered heart. I didn't know who I was anymore, and I reached the lowest point in my life. I no longer wanted to exist. My children were the only thing keeping me alive. I ended up writing goodbye letters to them just in case he finally achieved his goal of killing me like he promised.
I ended up going to England as a missionary, but over time had no money to send back to the church headquarters, let alone feed myself. I owned nothing but the clothes on my back. Most days, the woman I married was too depressed to get out of bed. Much of the missionary work fell on me. I was so alone. Late one night, what I thought were all my feelings played before me like a movie. I snuck out of the bedroom, headed for the kitchen, and pulled out a knife. The only way out. But then, a moment of clarity washed over me, and a promise of hope whispered, "Get out of this cult now, before it's too late. You can turn your life around." I put the knife down.
It was the weekend of my 30th birthday. My children and I were hiding in one of the back bedrooms while my abuser kicked holes in the wall of the hallway. I kept the children distracted as we hid in the closet, our legs all bunched together, their sweet innocence cradled in my arms. I finally had the old me come back and tell myself, "You're not going to spend one more weekend hiding. You are not going to waste your 30s like you did your 20s. I divorced my abuser, left the cultist church, and have never once looked back. Meanwhile, my abuser is now a convicted felon."
When my term in England ended, the church leaders asked me to stay, and I said, hell no. Got on a plane and went back to the Midwest, back home. Once I settled in, I got divorced from my abuser and started buying whatever loaf of bread I wanted. Despite my abuser's best efforts to continue to emotionally manipulate me and my family, I started living my own life. I wanted to find a woman of my dreams to spend it with. I never thought I'd actually find her, but then I met Jenny.
I've always told Branden we were cut from the same cloth. Our stories of abuse were so similar, our timelines nearly the same. It was as if the universe or God had allowed us to be there for one another even before we met. I used to cry myself to sleep at night, and on those same nights, Branden was in agony too. On those dark nights when we felt so alone, a whisper of hope told us to hold on, because the night gets darkest before the dawn. I am certain we were urged onward so we could finally find each other.
With my beautiful bride by my side, Jenny, the woman who I got to choose, I feel free. I finally have joy. I finally got to experience fatherhood. The first night as we walked out of that Asian restaurant, I knew the next chapter of my life was finally beginning. I held my future wife's hand on the way to the Jeep, and with butterflies in my stomach, I opened up the passenger door like a gentleman. And as I got in the car myself, I drummed up enough courage. And I turned to Jenny and I asked, "Can I kiss you?"
And I said, "Sure." And we haven't stopped kissing since.
All right, thank you, Jenny and Branden, so much for that.